Okay, you guys in the philosophy group might appreciate this. These are usually the audience for these videos. Uh, in my role playing group on our Discord, the AI discussion has taken light as it does with everyone now. But in particular, I am one of the causes, I suppose, of this um, particular discussion because when I am game mastering, what I do is I post a recap heading into the next week that talks almost like in a journalistic fashion about the stuff that happened, portraying the Lord of the Land as the keeper of the flame and always there to prevail against the enemy or whatever. And I always include an AI image of something that happened, right? I ask Chat GPT, usually after 3 or 4 prompts, it comes up with basically what I'm looking for so that I can post an image that kind of portrays what's going on. And this is something that offends some of the people that work or play rather at this place that I go to because they themselves consider themselves artists who work on commission, and they feel like this is just an anathema to their and a threat to their very existence. And it of course touches on a lot of the subjects we talk about in philosophy, right? It's basically, are we being replaced, or the Westworld question, if you can't tell the difference, doesn't matter. Now, because of this, right, this has been going on for about a week or so, this back and forth just in general about intent is really what it comes down to, right? Like, none of us make money at this. The guy who owns the shop makes money about the fact that we're coming together to play off of the admission or whatever. But it's important to note that I'm not trying to portray any of this as original work or anything like that. I mean, it sort of, but it's certainly not something that I'm putting out there thinking, oh, okay, I'm gonna, put my signature on this and make a bunch of money, right? This is just something that I do to kind of give some texture and flavor to the game I'm running, which in and of itself is derivative. Okay, most of what I play against is against, first of all, it's Dungeons and Dragons, which is a specific rule set, which is copyrighted, and we pay for the books and all that other stuff. We have the licensed right to use that. The story material, also, most of it is cribbed out of Dungeons and Dragons lore, which also is stuff that you pay for, but it's just backdrop ultimately. It's legend that, in theory, if you wrote books and tried to make money on it, then you would have to pay a license to somebody. But when you're making a role playing game that's just for fun, just for your friends, there's no money being made, so there's no damages to be done, right? That's understood about role playing in general, and that doesn't matter what the property is. Okay, but again, most of this information, most of the lore and everything else, the monsters, all that stuff, all come from Dungeons and Dragons lore. Um, and in addition to that, there's other stuff, of course, that you add that are pop culture references and tropes and all these other things, right? And the point I finally engaged in this conversation, and I said, the thing about AI, first of all, the thing that you, because they're all worried about the artists being ripped off, and I said this only became an ethical question when artists started having problems, when people started seeing writing that started to look good. My work has been getting cribbed for a decade. Okay, these generative programming, machine learning, whatever you want to call it, before they finally started branding it AI, has been taking material from people like me for a long time to figure out how to answer basic query questions, which are things like, I want the computer to do this, that, and the other, and it will write the code for you based on what it understands that you're asking for in against its own library of understanding how the code works, right? The machine is learning to program itself based on prompts. Now, of course, we're heading toward the singularity if we're not already there, all that other stuff where the machine is making the machine and doesn't need our input anymore or whatever. All that aside, um, we've been getting hit by this for a long time. This is not new. It's only now that we're discussing it because now artists and other people in the mainstream are starting to notice this. And why is that? Because you're not in the plumbing. Now you're looking at the final product that's being AI created, and now it's a problem, right? But the machinery to make that has been humming along for a long time. Okay, so that was the first thing I wanted to call out. Is that this discussion, if you wanted to have it, should have happened 10 years ago when people like me were the ones that were getting screwed. You don't think about engineers, though. We're always in the engine room. And unless there's bad news, there's no news. And that's you. Life goes on. People only complain when the power doesn't work or the water doesn't turn on, right? That's how it goes. Whatever. It's a thankless job being an engineer unless you actually manage to pull off a miracle. And then they'll be happy with you for a little while. And then it's back to work with you. But the second part was that I tried to underscore the second part is all of this is derivative, right? All of it is. And in fact, if we go far enough, art is in general derivative. You know, there is nothing new under the sun. Now, are there specific artists that had a new take, a new tweak, a new way of looking at things? Absolutely. You know, and science has epiphanies all the time. There's always some new thing being discovered and figured out. This is true. This is part of human ingenuity. But as time goes by, we lean on our tools, including computers, including artificial intelligence, to come up with new epiphanies and new discoveries and to be more efficient at the things that we do. Blah, 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 blah. Right? But with creative art, Joseph Campbell talked about this in the 50s. The human experience is at its core fairly universal. You know, we're born, we know about our death, we have to interact with other human beings in order to survive. To not to be away from human beings is in and of itself a trial, a struggle that you write stories about. Man versus nature is what that is. um and there are things that when it comes to storytelling in particular that we come to expect cross cultural boundaries. This is an anthropic thing. This is something about us being primates and about basic form of community in how we understand stories need to be told, right? If I tell you a story about the brave young prince who runs off, into the woods to save the princess and meets the salamander god and gets the spear and meets the forest god and gets the shield and then runs up to the dragon and then just gets eaten, that's not a good story. Yes, I know dragons are dangerous. Why? What was the point of him going to all that if he just got ate? I need a moral out of this, right? That is the part of it, is that real life does not look like storytelling. Storytelling follows a certain set of patterns that we are all looking for. And we know a bad story when we see one. We may not understand why, but we feel it, right? And so, in that regard, Joseph Campbell basically said for thousands of years, there's been nothing new. You have a mentor, you have a young hero, you have a damsel in distress or whatever, and they can all change shapes and look different ways, right? But the point that Vogler, his successor, made was that you take the story Star Wars, which is a science fiction fantasy story about a magical force and laser swords and spaceships, and you turn that into a story about knights in castles, and it's the same exact story. Darth Vader being Luke's father, that is core and critical. But Darth Vader being the Count of, you know, Bordeaux, and Luke being, the bastard scion of some other person that he thought that he was the son of, or whatever, that changes the story if you change that fundamental of him being this evil lord's father or son rather. But the nature of that lord doesn't really matter at all. Really, his status to some extent just as a bad guy is really the only thing that matters, right? So we boil things down to these core concepts. And when I'm telling a story through role playing, and this is common across the way, you want to put out a lot of familiar things that people understand and recognize so they can pick up what you're putting down, right? It's as simple as like the old man with, a tale to be told. Chances are he's going to be providing you the information you need to go on your adventure, right? That is kind of how you do it in a role playing scenario, because to make it too obscure makes them lost. They don't know how to interact with your world. And in fact, I would argue some of the poorer role playing experiences I've had is when you don't have enough context clues like that. I need that information in order for me to have a good time and have a good storytelling experience, right? But we get down to the idea that all of human experience now, all of humans' documentation, all the stuff that we create is now being poured into a giant hopper. and being blended down and consolidated into this AI monstrosity that we are currently living through and creating and feeding ourselves. And the argument is, this is a problem. Well, why? Why is it a problem? Well, because I'm not making money. Well, the Gutenberg press put a lot of monks that were working in scriptoriums their entire life out on their asses. They had to go like make beer or whatever it was that monks had to do, or go learn, get a real job, learn how to read the Bible or whatever, I don't know. But that technological disruption has been part of human history forever. And yes, it sucks when it happens, but at the end of the day, we learn to adapt and move forward. There are plenty of detractors against the newspaper, plenty of detractors against television and radio and all those other things that are now just byproducts and common dust because this generation has lived with all that. The children that are being born now won't know a world without AI agents that help them do their research or whatever, feed them their information. So what they're concerned with really is, when you get right down to it, how much humanity is in here, right? If it took 10 different images and blended them together and created it and said, this is mine, but it's all derived from other stuff, that's artificial. That's a problem. I don't like that because those original artists weren't credited. Well, I gave the example, which was not well received because they've got their own feelings about it. But I said, let's say I read a book called Twilight. It was a good book. I really liked the book. I don't think Twilight was all that great, but whatever. I liked the book Twilight, but I'd really have liked it to go in a different direction a little bit. The vampire part doesn't really concern me too much. I don't mind if they're vampires or even immortal or whatever, but I really like the sexy things that could go on here. So I write a risque book called 50 Shades of Grey. And it becomes a #1 bestseller and is sold in airports and has a blockbuster movie and all that other stuff. 50 Shades of Grey, of course, for those who've paid attention, is a bit of fanfic that was written about Twilight. It's just a different story with the names removed to protect the copyrights, right? It's completely derivative. I say the author, a human being, wrote this book that is completely derivative of another work, has its own twist, enough to make it comply with copyright law, but it's still obvious. But that's okay. We're okay with that. But if a machine did the same thing, now we have a problem, right? And I brought up the idea of materialism to these guys, which is something we talked about not so long ago. And my understanding of materialism, and it's a very simplistic one, but it's that our entire human experience is based on a result of our neurological programming. That everything is about our neurochemical output, and that our experience, while we may have a consciousness, so to speak, it's only because of the composite of that activity and with no divine spiritual aspect to it whatsoever. Okay, I don't happen to believe this, but that is a valid viewpoint. And to that extent, they say if human thought, human consciousness is only a product of this computational whatever that's happening in our brain, therefore, a computer, a silicon brain that has its own conscious experience, so to speak, is no different. I mean, it's different on the basis, but it's no different from a value perspective than the human brain is. And by extension, art that is created by a human has no more innate value than art that's created by a monkey or created by a robot, or created by something else, because those things have the same raw materials for whatever this creative spark that we have is able to come up with that. And part of that understanding is that we're programmed. We don't understand anything new. We just mash stuff together, just like cooking. Eggs, flour, all these different components can all be mixed up in a variety of different ways in different quantities to make a variety of different dishes, but at the same but at the end of the day, it's all the same material, right? And that's the argument from the materialist perspective. And of course, that sounds reductive. Humans are just computers. That sucks. I don't want to think that. But There are people who believe this. So when you're positing this argument that it's the human experience, it's the human spirit or something that adds something to this art, you have to be mindful that's just an opinion. That's not actually a fact. And so we drill back down to, why is this opinion so important for you to hold on to, right? Why is it that you so vehemently refuse to accept the idea that your own experience is not special in any way, except for that it's a rather unique blip in how the universe has put a bunch of materials together? And that's what it comes down to, is we are afraid of being duped. We are also afraid of being replaced. I don't like AI because it makes me less valuable. If it takes me 2 days to draw a really good piece of art, and it takes the computer 30 seconds to come up with something similar, I am out of a job. It's that simple. Because, in the same way that an illustrated Bible is beautiful, it's also rare and expensive. And my task at hand, a lot of times with an illuminated Bible, is not to look at the pretty art, although that's nice. It's to read what's in there. And the Gutenberg Press eliminated all those illuminations and made the Bible cheap and available for people to read. And then when it got translated, even more available for people to read still. If the task is to read the Bible and understand it, an illuminated manuscript is no better than one that was generated out of a Gutenberg press or by one that was printed off my photocopier here, for example, right? If that's my goal, is to read it. And that's what a lot of this comes down to, is my task is to come up with an image that portrays this creative scenario. I'm going to have the computer do it. I'm not going to pay a commission to an artist. That's another part of it, is I'm not paying anybody for it. And I wouldn't have paid in the first place. We would have just gone on without it. But it doesn't have to be an all or nothing thing. Now, I don't have a way to show on the screen what I'm talking about here, but I did post a couple pictures. I said the thing is I used AI to generate some images because I bought a miniature for playing Dungeons and Dragons. And Sam, I asked her if she would paint it for me, and she agreed, but she wanted something to work with, right? So I put my images together, and I came up with this as my concept character, full body concept character, based off of a previous AI image I generated a year before. And she painted a miniature that looked like this. So in that way, me being able to tell the AI, this is the image that I'm looking for, and I had to go back and forth with it. You know, tweak this, do this, change this, do that, do that, whatever. Finally get this image I'm really happy with. Then I can send it to my artist in this regard, so she knows what she's trying to go against. Now, of course, the response was, well, you could have searched on the internet for hours and found multiple different pictures, of collage that you could have submitted to her. And that's true. I could have said, make the face like this, but the hands like this, but the armor like this, but the color scheme like this, and have her try and use her own flourish. But it may not be exactly what I want. And that's what artists also hate, is when the client is like, oh, can you turn that this different color? Or this isn't what I was thinking, right? This allows me to come up with and prompt over and over automation that comes up with that prompt that is perfect, or more or less perfect, for what I'm trying to do. This is the character. This is her right here. But here's the other part. Oh, I wouldn't frame an AI image. I wouldn't rely on that because it's just not real or whatever. I love that picture of my character that the Chat GPT came up with. I am absolutely in love with that image that it created of her. Why is that? And I'm going to tell you why, because I've been thinking about it for a while. So this comes down to a lot of deep Forgotten Realms lore. This is my OC, as they call them, my original character, but she belongs in that world. She is a half elf. What that means is she is part human, part elf, but she comes from a race of what are called dark elves. Now, in that lore, elves are essentially kind of magical creatures, kind of like in Lord of the Rings, a little different than those, but they're kind of in the same vein. They're naturey and kind of ephemeral and whatever, um, but very special creatures. And in their creation myth, the husband and wife, they basically go to war. It's a war in heaven, and the wife goddess is evil, and she gets cast out, and all of her people get sent into the dark. They're cast down into the darkness, into the underdark is what this place is called. And those that particular brand of elf are called dark elves, and they have weird powers and all this other stuff, and they're a ruthless society. And this character, my thought for her is that her mother was a human adventurer that wandered too far into that area and was captured and enslaved, and was the favorite toy of a prince of a noble house. So this character is a princess. She's a bastard princess of a noble dark elven house who, during political turmoil, managed to flee from her situation and had to live on the streets, and became essentially a cleric, a priestess of the good god of goddess of the dark elves, who's trying to reconcile things, right? Pretty nuanced when you get down to it. Half elven, looks like a regular elf except for her red eyes are the sign that she's from this other species of elf. So people who are cosmopolitan will know that she's not from around these parts and might be representative of those evil people. But her regalia and her goddess are all good, and she's good through and through, but she's afraid of her heritage, all this other fun stuff, right? But as a character, I imagine her as wounded but still strong, as gentle and feminine, but also quite capable in ways that oftentimes gentle and feminine are not portrayed in story, right? Want her to be a little different and strong and capable of standing on her own, but yet being vulnerable. A character I like to think of actually in this regard is the Wonder Woman in the at least the first movie, the first DC movie came out. It was great because she was powerful, she was strong. I compare this one to Miss Marvel. Miss Marvel was two dimensional. She was just perfect at everything, didn't need help from anyone, standoffish, boorish, just a miserable character, I thought. And of course, if you say that, you're like, oh, that's because you don't like strong women. No, I like vulnerable characters, male or female. Wonder Woman was the most powerful person on the screen, except for maybe the bad guy, Ares, who she's fighting. But the romantic interest is nowhere on her level. He has some special abilities, though. He's a pilot, so he knows how to fly a plane, and he can do other stuff, and he has a team of friends that are working on the side or whatever. But our main character, our heroine, is still way more powerful than almost anyone that shows up on the screen. But she still has weaknesses, she still has flaws, she still hurts, she still feels, she still cares, right? That's the kind of character I was going for. And when I got this image back, I was like, oh, this is perfect, this is exactly right. But I realized a little bit later, she looks a lot like She-Ra, the Princess of Power. She-Ra, when I was growing up, He-Man was one of my favorite cartoons. I loved He-Man so much. I had so many of those toys. She-Ra was an interesting. It was an interesting experiment by the folks at Mattel. I think it was Mattel that made those. She-Ra was He-Man's sister, or maybe half sister. I think she was his sister, but she was estranged somehow, and she ended up on another world. She had her own adventures, her own thing, but she also derived her powers from the Castle Grayskull, right? Now there were other female characters in the He-Man line, but they were very much their hair was plastic. They were very booby, very over the top. She-Ra was a little different. She-Ra, first of all, came from a different mold, and she had hair. She had like the long hair that a Barbie does. And I got She-Ra as a Christmas present. I'm pretty sure it was Christmas. And I was kind of like, what do I do with this? There's this hair to brush, I guess, which is a big deal, especially for Barbie toys. The girls' lines of toys, brushing the hair is a big deal. And they're adding this in, and here I find myself, I'm brushing this hair of this warrior doll, very confusing. And she had a very similar look. She had she had her thighs lightly exposed under her, tasteful skirt, and she had armor, and she used a sword, and but her when she would raise her sword aloft, instead of lightning striking and all this explosion, it was this rainbow thing that would come down over her. So she was very elegant and fey, but also a powerful warrior. And I realized that's basically who I created. And the AI was able to figure out that is who I'm after. That's what's wild to me. It knows me well enough to know that with enough of my prompts, it said, "Who you want is an elven version of She-Ra. Here you go, brother." And bam, did it hit the nail right on the head. And I didn't even realize it until later. So I think that's part of the bigger scary bit, is that this stuff knows us better than we know ourselves. It's like, I know exactly what you're gonna like. Check this one out. You know, damn straight, I like that. Save that bad boy in a file. I'm gonna keep that one for a while, right? So that's really the biggest part of this, is that if the computer can come up with imagery that I like. Now, granted, I don't have a sophisticated taste in art. I don't like abstract art. I don't like to have to think too much about art. I don't like horror art. I don't like art that's like obscure for the sake of being obscure, all that stuff. I enjoy Japanese animation. I enjoy the simplicity of cartoons. I enjoy all that stuff. And I don't take any moral qualms with that. Do I consider myself an art aficionado? Certainly not. But I know what I like, and I like what a lot of people like, and the computer's smart enough to be able to figure that out. I fall into that 88% of the Pareto principle that likes this stuff. It has to dial me in a little bit. Oh, you're from the 80s. I bet you'll like a souped up version of this one, right? That's probably how it works out for a lot of us working with this stuff. It knows whenever I'm asking about any programming concept, it's SQL in particular that I'm after. It's not going to throw Python shit at me or Fortran shit or any of that stuff. It knows I'm a SQL developer. It'll tell me, look, you're going to have to shift out to PowerShell or whatever to do this because you can't do it in the engine or whatever. It'll tell me that flat out. And I imagine this is probably true to some extent from Google or whatever. When I'm typing in really awful things, about how to get away with murder or something like that, it's probably because I'm writing some creative situation. I have no intention of actually killing somebody. And the sites, similarly speaking, will send me to, like, hey, I'm a writer, and this is this scenario. Well, if you're in a sci-fi or whatever, right? It knows if he's asking about killing another human being, he's actually asking for academic slash creative purposes and not because he has plans. It's part of being profiled, I suppose. But uh, anyway, I just found it really interesting that this conversation has delved to that. But we're still trying to be respectful. And there's people get heated. People do. They really get heated about this stuff, especially because they feel like their livelihoods are being taken. And that may be true, but Pandora's out of the box is the problem. That's the problem with technology in general. I'm faced with the same problem. I'm staring down at it every day. That my job is getting harder. There are fewer and fewer folks that remain in my industry with the level of skill that I have. The newer people aren't learning it. First of all, because they're leaning too heavily on AI. But second of all, they just don't get the experience because they're not given the opportunity, and the computer does all that stuff anyway. All the complex stuff that it's happening is happening behind the scenes now. That stuff existed when I was coming up. People were like, "Oh, you need to learn assembly or you need to learn C++." You don't need to learn C++. You just don't, not unless you're doing something crazy, you know. But I'm getting to a point where you don't have to know SQL. Not quite there yet because it's not good at designing stuff. It's certainly not good at fixing broken legacy systems. AI is terrible at that. But it'll get better. It's only going to get better. And just in a few years, that image that I generated of that character went from the Kludgy AI tool I was using that came up with just weird images with multiple too many fingers, or, three arms or whatever, just in these random places. It's good now. That looks like a character I would see on the cover of a comic. It looks like the cover of a comic book. Entirely derivative of existing material, but unique enough to say she's different. She's a half drow princess on the run, a cleric of Elistray who wants to set the world right, one fallen elf at a time. There's nothing unique about that. It's just my own twist. And that kind of character is of interest to me and to the players I play with. Just like Dante Inferno, the languid tiefling being a part demon who's got some horns and he's got a hat and he's very sure of himself. He's very much like Doc Holliday from Tombstone. Very devil may care, you know, every day is a borrowed blessing kind of attitude. It's not quite where he's coming from. He's also derivative, very derivative of that character. Not exactly like him, different situation. His mother is Elvira, a succubus who looks like Elvira, the host of the whatever it was, the Monday Night Horror show or whatever it was that she used to host, you know? And she's a bit over the top, just like that. Although she's got an accent too, kind of like a transcontinental accent, you know, and running around with her as a completely derivative character. Yeah, she's a monster from Dungeons and Dragons who looks pretty much like this TV show host from the 1970s and 80s. But people like it. People like the familiar. That's the reality. You know, you write a book. The editor says, "Yeah, I want more of the same, but different, but the same." You know, because that'll put butts in seats. That's how you end up with so many superhero movies in the 2010s. So many. The or retellings of the Batman. How many retellings of the Batman do we need? We'll never have enough. That's the fact of it. Enough years go by, it stops being new. It's become old. Well, it becomes new again. Make another twist on that story and another $1 billion. This time it'll be written by AI and they'll maybe even do a better job than a human would. God knows they could have used AI's help during the last 3 Star Wars movies. I could have told you that was going to be a disaster. I would have taken half the money those writers got. So that's part of it too, is we have to be careful what we're feeding into the computer, because what comes out is a product of what goes in. Microsoft Tay. I think that was 13 years ago now. Microsoft Tay was released out on Twitter. Microsoft Tay was the first stab that Microsoft made at AI. And it wasn't 12 hours before that thing was a screaming racist. It read everything that we had online. And it was like a mirror held right back up to humanity. This is who you are, folks. We have to shut Tay down because he's an awful, awful creature and he looks just like us. So we'll have to be careful how we program these things so that we actually like the output we get. But so far, we seem to be liking what it's doing. The problem is, how are we going to eat when it does all our jobs for us?